Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. Our guest on today's episode is Amy Chesler. She's the author of a new book called Working for Justice, One Family's Tale of Murder, Betrayal, and Healing. And the title of the book is apt, as you will hear when you hear our conversation about Amy's story, her family, the tragic murder of Amy's mother at the hands of Amy's brother, and the background to what led up to that, the healing and coming to terms with what happened that followed, and a bit of our philosophizing together about why this is justice and what does that mean, and what can all of us, those who have been victims, or as Amy explains it, co-victims of a violent crime, and those of us who just feel that pain, even if we haven't known it directly in our lives, what can we learn from this experience, and what is there to gain from sharing in Amy's own experience? So what a really just, I think, gripping and emotional and inspiring conversation we have to offer you. My conversation with Amy Chesler. Stay tuned for the next episode of Good Law, Bad Law. Welcome to our guest today, Amy Chesler. She's the author of the new book, Working for Justice, One Family's Tale of Murder, Betrayal, and Healing. Amy, from Los Angeles, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
This is really, such an upsetting story even to hear about, let alone to imagine you having lived through in your family. And so I really, first of all, just appreciate you sharing that story in the book, and now sharing the story with us. It's perhaps a story not that uncommon, but to be able to hear it and learn from it and appreciate, what happens not only to the immediate victim, in this case, your mother, as we're going to hear, your mother's death at the hands of your brother, but to understand the impact on the other members of the family. And that's something I think that people perhaps don't think about as much. And so I'm particularly interested to hear about that side of this, and to understand better your story, as well as the fact that we're coming up on a point where the criminal justice system in this case has done what it did, and that your brother is in prison for this murder, but is now coming up for parole, which just brings back everything. And so I want to get into that as well. First, though, just give our audience a little bit of background on yourself, and then I want to get into the story of what happened and how you came to write this book and why you wanted to write this story.
Got it. Well, like you said, I'm Amy Chesler. I'm from LA. I'm actually an LA native. There aren't that many of us, I guess. And I was a former teacher. I explained in the book, I actually used to work with my mom. She was a teacher as well. We're generations of teachers, for years. And I kind of decided very young, I also wanted to be a writer. And they say, write what you know. And I didn't know what I knew as a child, obviously a child who went through a lot of sibling abuse. That, like you said, I learned the more open I am about it, the more I realize it's very common. But yeah, so I went through this horrific, awful experience. I was a teacher at the time. I threw myself into, work and kind of lost myself and gained a little semblance of a back when I became a parent. And so I am a mother, first and foremost, a writer, and somebody who sought a lot of healing because, again, very polarizing life situations. I feel we have the onus of responsibility. In the book, I explain, I think everybody has a story. Not everybody is a storyteller, but I always had that in me as a teacher, as a book lover. So when I came to this crossroads of healing, I realized that when I did a live piece, I was inspired to just keep going with it. It was healing for me to share my story, and and here we are.
And what did you teach during the years you were doing that?
Wow, I have been all over the map at K through 12th, really. My first boss was Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I actually taught for an after school program that he started, even as early as like my freshman year in college. So I've taught everything from dance to English. My last semi-permanent gig, or permanent gig rather, was at Calabasas High as an English teacher.
Okay. And Calabasas is the town in California where you were raised, right? And where you and your brother lived with your mother during this time.
Yes. And yes, we moved there when I was in kindergarten, and I have gone about a mile from it. So yes, I'm actually really local, but I worked there, and we were part of the community for a long time. Yes.
And you mentioned your mother being a teacher too. She was apparently a very beloved teacher in the community, and which is strange for me because I always had pretty lousy math teachers. But your mother was a math teacher who was actually beloved by your students, right?
Yeah, she just loved her work so much. And yeah, she never taught I mean, she taught in Calabasas when I was young as a substitute teacher, but eventually she went, like, again, a mile and a half away to Canoga Park, and was a math teacher. She mostly middle school, then high school, and she was just so passionate about making a change, I think. Which is another reason which led me to write the book too, I think. Not to bring it back, or to bring it back, I guess. She always taught me, like, if you have something to say, especially if it's of importance, you say it, because it can only be healing. I think that loose lips don't sink ships. They, communication brings catharsis. So,
Wow.
And that's one of her biggest lessons, even with her students. Yeah.
All right. So, I mean, this is a tragic story. Ultimately, your brother killing your mother, and the way you found out about that, and the trauma I'm sure that caused. But give us some of the background, because I think, as unfortunately as when we hear stories like this, there is a lead up to a something tragic like this happening. It often doesn't happen all of a sudden and for no reason that anybody can point to. So the background is important, and it also directly affected you in your early years of growing up. But give people a sense of what that background was in the case of your brother, a very troubled young guy, and your mother in the context of your family.
Whether it's in therapy or on a podcast or anything, I usually will start by saying I am a victim of domestic violence, and a survivor, but my mother is not. And generally the assumption is, oh, your father. And no, my brother was very abusive, honestly, from a very early age. When I think back, even stories of him at 3, 4 were super manipulative. He would sell treasure maps that he drew. When my mom took him to the grocery store to buy things, he would try to sell them to people as he passed through the aisles. And my mom thought that was cute. But now, as a beginning, I see that as relatively manipulative. And he kind of just honed his craft over time. And I think it's something that we don't really talk about enough in our, probably a lot of cultures, but ours as well, is what happens behind closed doors. And domestic violence, abuse of any type kind of persists because of a silence or a not discussing of things. People knew my brother was different. Teachers, over the years, he had conflict with all of them. There was never a teacher he ever identified with, even if my mom was a teacher. Not even my mom. There were doctors. He was diagnosed relatively young. Actually, he's one of the earliest cases in America diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And he was given kind of a little bit of a slew of diagnoses that are, not to belittle, but almost, much more common nowadays. And I think we have a better understanding nowadays, but he kind of used it, he weaponized his diagnoses to a certain degree.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that, Amy?
He would abuse them. He would use them as, he was very abusive towards us. So, he, in the story in my book, the timeline kind of hops around, so it's hard to understand, but he abused me, started abusing us, probably physically, emotionally, verbally, probably around the age of 12 or 13. It got really bad when he was around 16, at the same time that he attempted suicide. So at that attempt, he was given, to kind of understand his behavior, his very erratic, very violent, very angry, very entitled now, with retrospect, I see. I think doctors needed to understand him, but these doctors that give him these labels actually stopped seeing him. Many of his doctors, which would eventually happen in the court system with his lawyers, he was very abusive to them too. I remember a doctor, a woman, he hurled feminist, the opposite, feminine slurs at her, and she just said, I can't deal with this kid anymore. And so that was kind of like an unending cycle, with medical professionals, teachers, and us. And the problem with us, and now as a parent, I understand, the unconditional love that comes with that role, I think, and also the unconditional hope for your child. My mom kind of, that unending cycle of domestic violence or abuse, of the abuse, the apology, the I promise I'll be better, you deserve more, and then the detrimental treatment again.
Well, and also I would also, and this isn't meant as a criticism, but just I think as a human reaction, a certain kind of denial too, because you don't want to accept that your child has a problem, and so there's all kinds of ways that you can make apologies for those behaviors.
Absolutely. And there were plenty of police phone calls as well. He was arrested several times in my youth. The police visited my home quite a bit. The first once or twice was because of how he was abusive towards us before, but the cops were called. I remember I think the first time was on that suicide attempt. That was like the paramedics, the cops, it was just the whole shebang. And then that phased out, and he became just violent towards us and no longer himself at all around probably 17. And it really, really escalated, I would say, when I went to college, and I got out a little bit more. And that's when the book starts, in essence. I explain how I was given a bit of freedom and responsibility, and I kind of naturally used that as an escape from my awful home life.
Right.
But
how much older is your brother?
He is 2 years, 11 months older.
Okay.
I was kind of always the older sibling, in essence. I remember even as young, probably as 9 or 10, when he was 13 and we were being left alone, because mom had to work or whatever. There was Saturday school. I don't know what it was, an errand. She would always say, like, just make sure he doesn't burn down the house. And it was relatively a joke, but it was also not a joke.
Right.
And yes, there's that enmeshment and a job too big for a 10 or 11-year-old in that. I don't know if any of us had the tools to deal. and I say this in my book, and I say this kind of a lot, but I think I had an eagle eye view now, not then, but of a person, my brother really related. He would have graduated in 1999. He did not. He finished or got his GED, which is like the equivalency test in California, in 97. But Columbine happened in 99, and he very much related to those boys, the boys who committed the Columbine. And I kind of always felt, at least now after he killed my mom, that I saw how detrimental his actions could be, or violent. I saw just how much he related to those boys. He stalked him. He had weapons. It was Craigslist days. He had access to things like that illegally, easily. And he would wield them towards me quite often.
When you say you're talking about guns? That he had guns?
I know he had a couple guns. I believe one of them might have been real. He shot me with one, but it was a BB gun. I didn't know. It was painted black, and he shot at me, and I lost my mind, but it was a BB gun, thankfully. It hurt a lot still, but so I'm not sure that I couldn't attest to what, but he had swords, he had knives, he had whatever he wanted. Illegal alcohol, absinthe at the time was illegal. He could, anything he kind of wanted. And I think a lot of times people say, well, what about the parenting in those situations? They kind of always want to look to the parents. But my mom, as much as she might have been in denial, and you're absolutely right, to a certain degree, just self-preservation, there has to be, I think, doesn't have to be, but sometimes, she had her master's in education. I just believe sometimes I realize some people are unparentable at times. And it's just a perfect storm of ingredients to make spur these people to cause harm to others.
Well, and you also pointed out that it's not like there weren't outside agencies and institutions that were aware of the situation on some level. The police, teachers, schools, counselors,
doctors.
Doctors, right. We think there is and it's interesting that you mentioned Columbine, because what I was thinking as I was listening to you describing what life was like before the murder took place, I was thinking about the mass shootings that we've become too familiar with, because it seems always like the question is, how did we, big, capital we, all the organizations and institutions in our society, family, friends, teachers, and so on, how did we not know? How did we not see this? And often the answer is we did see this.
It's just a little bit of a blind eye.
Right.
And what, it's interesting that we mentioned that, I think, and I always share, I wrote a piece, Where Does Hatred Come From? A long time ago. And my inclination is to share it every time there's a shooting. Oh God, I hate that statement, every time there's a shooting, but it's too true. But I think that as a country, we don't realize that we are all co-victims, and that is a real term. I am a co-victim of murder. Immediate family members, technically, I believe that is the definition of a co-murder victim by the state of California. But I believe every time there's this mass shooting, we all become co-victims, because gosh, what if it happens when we step into our grocery store or whatnot? And then we're waiting for that trial, and we all are waiting for the justice, which in my book, I kind of try to explain that it's not anything that comes easily, and it's not anything that just happens. And it's also something we kind of have to actively work for constantly. And I'm just learning that, unfortunately, at this stage in the process as well. But yeah, it's a little too poignant and pertinent at the moment.
I mean, that's a fascinating concept, the idea of co-victimness or victim.
Co-victimhood, I think.
Yeah. I mean, we go through these rituals of sending thoughts and prayers, worrying about our own children, memorial services.
We learn about the victims. We're learning that they're mothers and children, and we're, I mean, I get chills when I think. And oddly enough, not to interrupt you, I'm sorry, I did,
No.
but my mom's exact murder date, and this is such a weird, I get chills every time I mention it. It's a coincidence. September 25th, 2007, the exact year, day, everything became the National Murder Victims Remembrance Day.
Wow.
So I am joined, makes me tear up, but I am joined by every murder victim in the country to memorialize our lost loved ones at somebody else's hands. But I really do believe we're all joining in that together. And it's going to have to become a national phenomenon where we're all joining, unfortunately, as time goes on.
Well, this is further coincidence, but that also happens to be my mother's birthday, September 25th. So.
No way. Oh, wow. And the day has evolved for me too. As I say that, it's almost become a little bit of a beautiful, I can actually celebrate a bit rather than just be mired in depression.
Yeah.
But so happy almost birthday to your mother. A couple months.
Yeah. So, okay. So, well, we have to say a little bit about what actually happened. So maybe from your perspective, how you, and obviously we want people to read the book and read the whole story. So we're not going to tell the whole story here, but give us a little bit of how you found out what happened and what actually happened. Because I do want to save some time to talk about the coming to justice part of this story. It's so important. Well,
that's okay. I wouldn't be giving too much because that's only chapter 1, the night of. So, I, like you said, there's a buildup. I kind of always knew, unfortunately, this was coming. I didn't really know, but there were warning signs. My brother was very erratic. If there was some kind of fight about anything, I mean, it didn't have to be about anything, really. It could be like, hey, are you looking for a job? And it would erupt into something because he was 25 living at home with no job. So I saw the warning signs as coming months, as the months kind of unfolded that year, the fights would get worse. Maybe a couple months before, he had wielded a aerosol can and a lighter at her, and then jumped from our balcony on our second floor onto the driveway. I mean, it was, and I wasn't home. The worst, and what I realize now in retrospect, the worst of any abuse either she or I faced was always when the other person was gone. It was kind of like a numbers thing, I think, with power for him. And also a safety, I guess, in terms of the abuse and being able to have it persist. So it was getting worse and worse because I was out of the house a lot in the coming months. And that day in question, September 25th, 2007, I was working. I was working a lot at that time. My mom had gotten me the job working for Arnold, but I had worked my way up and I was a director of an after-school program now, and I had my own school. I had launched, and so I had moved away from her campus where we worked together. And I just started getting a rapid number of phone calls that day, back to back. And I could tell there was a lot of tension between the two of them. I explained in my book, I was kind of a fulcrum between the two of them. Mom and I were best friends, especially when he was gone. We found a rhythm. We had so much in common. But when he was a part of the equation, that changed my role a bit. And I allowed it, and I am learning the tools 14 years later, but at 22, it was hard to possess them. And I remember, just having a pit in my stomach at the succession of phone calls. And, he asked me, hey, are you going to be home? They both knew I was going to be gone for a bit. I was working, went and got a tattoo, oddly enough, that evening. It was a peace sign.
Oh.
And as I'm in that chair, I'm getting more phone calls, and I eventually start heading home because, it's late at night, and only he picks up now, which is very rare for my mom. If she knows I'm driving home, she's going to pick up to make sure I get home safely, or at least I'm, and after a couple of phone calls in a row, he told me not to go home. And just a pit. I'm driving on the 101, and we get a lot of car chases in our area. I'm like, am I going to end up as a car chase? Is this going to be worth it? Is this a joke? I don't know what "don't go home" means, but like I knew in my heart that
That's pretty ominous, though.
yeah,
Something serious is going on.
yes. And my mom wasn't picking up the line, which was never something that she would ever do. So I finally got a hold of him again after many tries on both of them, and he admitted, he said, "Don't go home. I killed mom." I think there were many expletives that fell out of my mouth, and I said, "No, you didn't." And he said, "Yes, I did," and he hung up. And I think that's when he shut off his phone. I sped down the freeway and called 911. I thought, if this was a joke, I'll explain my way out of it somehow. Unfortunately, it was not. I arrived. I was on the phone with 911. It took a little while. Phone calls from a cell phone don't often click immediately.
Right.
As I was walking in, the 911 operator said to me, "Don't go inside. The killer might still be inside." And I went, "Oh shit, he might be." He told me he had left, and I just kind of blind faith believed it. And I went inside and I found her. And yeah, it'll be an image that never leaves my mind. It's something that makes me very vigilant about, murder videos and trauma porn and all that kind of stuff. And that was the night everything changed, I guess you would say.
Well, and we talked about guns earlier, and there is obviously a big focus on guns and mental health and violence in this country. And not to take anything away from that, because that is a tremendous problem and something we could, with the right political will, do something to reduce the incidence of gun violence in this country. But your brother stabbed your mother, so this isn't one of those cases. It maybe is the broader issue, actually, of mental illness or mental health issues and violence, because we don't have to even get distracted by the issue of guns in this story. This could happen in any kitchen.
But the thing is he had access to anything, and he would use anything, and people like him exist, and they're the ones that I just read about a shooting this morning in Colorado, I believe. A man who always carried his gun, the article said, was angry at his ex-girlfriend for not inviting him to a birthday party. And that was that, and that evening, the story that came out, and my brother admitted, and friends said that was the story. He got angry because he was making a sandwich, and she said, as he sat down to eat, "Can you clean up before before you eat, because I want to make something too." And he said no, and it erupted into a fight, and he used the knife he made a sandwich with. So, yes, it's just the access to anything. And yes, that could happen anywhere, unfortunately. And the more I talk about my brother's violence and violent tendencies and the sibling abuse I face, the much more I find it is so common. And the more I think back on it, there were warning signs. I have a scar on my finger from when he sliced me at like 17, and he, you go back farther, and there's always those warning signs. Like he
shot a gun at you too. I mean,
yeah,
lucky it turned out to be a BB gun and not something worse. But yeah, that's
absolutely right.
That's a pretty good sign that there's problems. Let's talk about the coming to justice or finding justice, because we've touched on it in a couple of different ways that a person might think about justice. What does justice even mean in a situation like this? But in maybe the most literal sense, our legal system, our criminal justice system, first of all, it wasn't easy getting him to accept responsibility and allow himself to be held accountable. If you can call it that. Talk about that a little bit, because that's, from what you've described so far, there's really not a lot of debate. There weren't other suspects. There wasn't really a question about who done it. It was really about getting him to a point where he would accept responsibility beyond his admitting it to you over the phone as you were driving home that evening.
Yeah, I don't even think he really took responsibility. He's admitted it. He is, I say, it took years to convict my admittedly guilty brother, because that's it in a nutshell, the process. But it doesn't describe, oh gosh, it was such a tenuous process. So he admitted it that night. He was captured that evening. That's chapter 2. And he, just from the get-go, used every loophole he could possibly find in the process. I can't give away too much, but in essence, one of his skills was the things that he had sharpened and honed was his anger, and he wielded that at some lawyers, and they just up and quit. So that would stop the process and make those months, because it was, someone would be there for a month or two and then quit, and then the next lawyer would come and have to educate themselves on the case, and then a month or two and then quit, and then that became a year or so. Another tactic he took was, getting on his medicine, getting off his medicine. He was fit to stand trial, and he was unfit to stand trial. Then he was fit to stand trial, and those are just 2 of the many things. He tried to hire a hitman. To kill me. There are so many things he did to extend desperate outside of the law, inside of the law, that he tried to kind of wield in order to prolong the process. And years into it, he finally, without again giving too much, took a plea deal. Now, and I say in my book, I don't think justice is ever, someone's life has been stolen. There's no real justice to be had. And we're learning that again as a country. We just saw a little bit of justice, and then justice, really? No.
It's not bringing George Floyd back, right? It's not.
And I'm at this point where I'm going, well, hold on, what's the parole process in that state? And I'm finding, when my brother took the plea deal, it had to life in the verbiage, in that. But and at that time, the assistant DA explained to me, to life generally means to life. Like, chances of him getting out are relatively slim. They're always there, but and so I kind of felt confident. Didn't want a plea deal. I wanted him to get the max he could, but it was years into it, and he had exhausted me. And so what I'm learning now is that in California, if you serve 85% of your minimum sentence, you can apply for parole. So although he was only convicted 9.5 years ago, we're already looking at a parole hearing in August. And that's after a lifetime of abuse that I have faced. So, and I think that we also assume grief and healing starts as soon as someone dies. But in the justice process, in this process, I feel that healing and grief can't even occur. It's almost suspended until we have some sort of answer. And that answer takes so long. And that answer isn't even an answer sometimes.
That's so fascinating. And so, it's often said justice deferred is justice denied. And delay in justice, is essentially the same thing here. So your own process of struggling through this and processing what happened and looking for healing and moving on in your own life, that is another way in which you are a co-victim, isn't it? Because how long it takes and how the criminal justice system does what it does has a big impact on that healing.
Absolutely.
And the grieving process is central to that healing process.
And also the trauma, because it was almost sort of doubly traumatic for me to go through that whole years long process in order to get some sort of answer and not really have an answer, because here we are. People, and also I think that I'm gonna I didn't really know I'd be launching myself down this path. I said I wanted to be a writer, didn't know what I knew. Now I'm learning through a lot of therapy, and work and writing and sharing what my mission is. but that might even keep me kind of healing permanently, because as I share my story more, I am receiving so many other people's stories. And it feels beautiful to be part of a community and find community in my loss. I think that's been the most healing part of it, but it's overwhelming as well. So it's very important to kind of just bask in yourself in that. But that is almost like a lifelong process too, I think, as you have to. So
as you've gone through this, though, Amy, the experience itself, the aftermath, the process of your brother being brought to at least a kind of justice, and then taking up the story and writing the book, what do you think you bring and your story brings, and your own perspective and personal experience with what has happened in your life and in your family? What do you think you bring through all of that to that community, and frankly to the rest of us? Because I guess fortunate that I haven't experienced that kind of loss in my life, but so maybe in a more distant or less directly connected way, even though I experience it, I feel empathy, I feel sympathy, I feel for what has happened, but I can't directly relate to it. So what do you think all of what you've been through and what you bring forth in this book brings to other people, should they read the book and share your story?
That's a great question. Probably several things. I think that, like I said, everybody has a story. I think it's important to share these stories. And I think when we share our perspectives, I don't think, as much as you might have not have gone through something similar, or exactly similar, my dedication to my book is to anyone who, the exact wording might be, because I'm awful, but to anyone who's felt alone in their story, and to mom who has, loved me so fiercely, her presence still remains. But in essence, you don't have to have gone through what I've gone through. My perspective, I think part of it is that I'm a teacher. So, I don't want to teach English anymore. Maybe I want to teach my perspective, or also take on other people's. I think perspective is important, whether you've gone through it or not, because it shows us the more we have in common, and also the value in just other people's perspectives and experiences. I also, mom, it's a little, it's weird. She wasn't a reader. I was the reader in the family, but she only read true crime books. I know, like, I can think of her bookshelf, and it was just creepily only true crime books. And I think, and I was always kind of like a fan of it as well. And then I saw it for real. And I say in my book, once you've seen it for real, you don't want to see it or think about it for fake. But I think my mission is to bring a humanistic side. We've lost some of, it's like a stats thing, like, a shooting, how many people were killed? What is their story? How old are they? Next, almost. Right. And I want to bring a humanistic side to it. My book includes diary entries from my mom. The reviews, it makes me cry, but the first review I got was my 9th grade English teacher, who I eventually taught with, and she said my book is a love letter to my mom. Oh. I want to revive her, but I think there are lessons to be derived from her, from us, from our family, and her death is not in vain when people learn from it, when I learn, when I heal from it, when I teach from it. So that is my goal. Sorry, through tears.
No, you're touching my heart listening to you talk about it. And, we've talked about this notion of justice. As a lawyer, of course, that's central to what we study and what we practice, hopefully, if we have a sense of that, the importance of justice. But it is a very elusive concept in so many ways. I actually wrote a book too, years and years ago, before I went to law school, about an SS officer who escaped Europe after World War II and true story, lived in Argentina in open hiding for 40 years. And then as an 80-year-old man was arrested and sent back to Germany to stand trial for the deaths of some 3,500 Jews in Poland. And I asked similar questions in that book to what I'm asking you here, and what I ask myself all the time, which is, what is justice? I mean, you're not going to bring back your mother. You're not going to bring back those 3,500 Jews. You're going to fall short in a lot of ways, if that even, even if there is some concrete way that you can put your finger on what justice actually is. But you did call your book Working for Justice. And so what did you have in mind with that? And what do you think justice is in a story like this, in your experience?
Great question. I think the reason why I titled it Working for Justice was to imply, and the working, not worked, is basically I'll have to do it forever. Once this parole process starts, I'm going to have to go in every 3 to 4 years, 3 to 7 years now. I think that might be the policy in California. It's shifting a little. I'm educating myself. I'll have to do it for life. I'll have to try to keep him in there, or until I die, he dies, or he's freed. So I think the implication was it's always to be worked for. I think in the last few pages I explain, I think nothing grand or transformative like justice is ever just found or is given. It's worked for. That was one thing my mom always taught me, grit, you keep working. Justice, though, in essence, to me, I believe it is once again, justice when somebody's murdered, it's true justice is not possible. But I believe in, I think of the scales in law. There's a balancing with justice. Maybe it's not perfect. And sometimes, and again, like people are so sensitive these days. Oh my gosh, we have to talk about everything. Yes, because I think there's a balancing. And yes, there might be an up, hopefully victims are given a bit more power for a while. And maybe my story will, help launch that a bit. Justice is just, I think, a shifting, a rebalancing. So there is of power, I think. I'm trying to gain some of that power back and make a case for my mom. We never got a trial. Again, there was a plea deal. So part of the justice is my book, being able to tell our story.
Right.
Maybe not just to a judge and a jury, whoever will read the story. Part of, again, maybe it's not perfectly attainable, but I think everything is a spectrum to a certain degree. And nothing, nobody's perfect. Nothing is perfect. Justice will never be entirely met, but there's always some sort of balancing or righting to be had. And that's the justice, I think.
Well, and in Jewish thought and thinking, there's a concept called tikkun olam, which means to repair the world. And it doesn't mean you're to make the world perfect. It's just that we're all obligated to do what we can to make the world a little bit better. And maybe that's a kind of justice here. And
absolutely, I do. I'm sorry.
No.
I actually, in the Jewish religion, it's pretty present in my book and in my life and in my thoughts. But I for mentioning my tattoos, but also my brother killed my mom around Rosh Hashanah, and he pled guilty around Yom Kippur. But so there is, yes, but tikkun olam is, I think that is absolutely a semblance of justice, that balancing and that using whatever you've been given for good.
Even when you've been given what you've been given. I'm just so thrilled and honored to meet you and talk to you and hear your story. And we will put a link to the book in the description for the episode so people can get it. I encourage everybody to. I have a copy I'm going to be reading myself. Do you have a website, Amy? Is that something also we can include if people want to get more information about your background? And
Yeah, my website is amybchesler.com, and I can be found on all social media at Amy B. Chesler. That's, I'm sure they'll see my name. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, pretty easy.
Good.
Thank
Well,
you.
we will also put those links in the description, and good luck. Good luck at the parole hearing. I know what we're rooting for here, for you and for justice. And good luck with the book. And thank you so much again for being on Good Law, Bad Law. It was such a pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much.